what you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. I am your host Mike, and I am also your interview guest today because weirdly we're actually having an interview with Art Moni. She's going to be taking the reins today and interviewing me because it's going to be about finance, it's going to be about the great taking, and actually I'm not sure what else it's going to be about because she wrote the questions, not me. So welcome to the show, Art Moni. I hear you are now wearing an interviewer's hat. How does that feel?
Oh, that's definitely a new hat for me. And hello, everyone. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. It's been some time since we last spoke on the podcast. We've had some great conversations over the last year and a half. We spoke about the alchemy of art. We've discussed Sweden, cashless Sweden, when we went on a vacation there together. And that was quite a shocking trip when we couldn't use cash anymore. So that was an interesting one. We've discussed the Bretton Woods system together. You know, I thought that was a fantastic episode. We put in some great research, but when I put that up on YouTube, it got barely any views. So it was either heavily shadow banned or people just don't want to hear the history. I don't know. But listeners, I would recommend going out and checking that one out. It's the Bretton Woods 1.0. I can't remember the exact title, but I'll put it in the show notes. But how are you, Moni? How's things going? I hear it's summertime where you are right now.
Oh, yeah. It's the weather. The weather's lovely. It's very sunny, so I do enjoy it. There is a lot of garden work to do, which keeps me busy as always. But things are growing, which is great. We've got lots of rain. And it comes to our past episodes, one of my favorite was the one you titled "Boom Boom Bust" about the 2000 crash. And I thought that one was brilliant as well because whilst we were like discussing what happened in the markets back then, and we came to very interesting conclusions. And now I see the same patterns when it comes to Bitcoin. So I thought things are changing in terms of details, but they are always the same in terms of patterns. That episode just really rhymes with what's happening right now.
Yeah, I forgot about that episode. You've actually been on probably more episodes than any of the guests. So we've had some great conversations. But I'm going to hand it over to you because I'm meant to be the guest today. That's what I was told. So I'll hand it over to you, Art Moni. What questions do you have? What are we discussing today?
Yeah, I would like to hear from you. What inspired you to start a show, to become a podcaster, to start a YouTube channel? Because you are a host of two shows, Power Systems Broadcast and Power Mike Podcast. But actually, when you consider that before you had a totally different life and you decided to quit it all, change your life around and to start sharing your views and opinions publicly in social media. So what made that change?
Yeah, so what inspired me to start my own podcast? Well, you know, it was something that I'd been thinking about for a long time. And it was one of those things where there was no real guidebook as to how to do that. It was a case of if you're going to do it, you've just got to take a leap of faith because I didn't think anyone would want to listen to me. To be honest, I thought maybe I'll get a few views, maybe I'll get a small following, but you just don't know. And in terms of why I wanted to start it, it's because quite simply, I felt like the world was going to such a strange place, and I would say a dystopian place, that I just had this impetus, this desire to put something out there that might be helpful, that might be useful. And I've had a pretty interesting life. I like you said, had a career before I became a podcaster and a market analyst, which is a strange thing to even call myself. I don't see myself as any of these things, by the way. If somebody says I'm a podcaster, or even worse, an influencer, or a market analyst, I'm just Mike, and I'm just putting my stuff out there. If people want to listen, that's fantastic, and I appreciate it. But I didn't expect that to begin with. And like you were saying, I did have a life before all of this. I think listeners know I worked in social work and counseling for quite a few years. I was also training to be a professional athlete. Again, all off my own back, I guess. Nobody gave me a contract and said, Mike, you're a professional athlete. But I did decide at one point to really focus on ultra running, which was a massive passion of mine. In fact, it still is. I've just got back from an hour run in the forest. So I just absolutely love being out in nature, running in nature, physical activity, just getting in touch with my body. And I think nature is like one giant cathedral. It's like going to the church for me, although it's way better. So I love to be out in nature, and I was pursuing that for a while. And then I guess I had an interesting childhood as well because of my father, who I've mentioned a couple of times. He was very high up in crime. So he was a notorious gangster, you could say, and he was involved in some high-level crime, including actually there was links to the largest gold heist in history, which my father was not a part of, but he was connected to the man who was a part of it. And there was rumors that the crime that my dad went to prison for was funded from some of that gold. So an interesting link up there, which I actually never found out until I was much older. But I guess I've had an interesting life, and I've also had a pretty crazy life because I'm one of those people that learns the hard way. So I've definitely put myself out there many times, tried, failed, and that was useful. And at some point, I decided to try with finance, but that time I was dedicated and I decided, I'm not going to fail this because I can't afford to, because if I lose all my money, it's going to be catastrophic for me and my family. So I really threw myself into that after my running career ended through injury, and I had a lot of time on my hands. I used to spend probably 50, 60 hours a week focusing on athletic sports, running, and especially the psychology of sports, which is something most people don't think about. But I put at least as much time into that mental side of training as I did the physical. And then when that was taken away from me, I was like, well, what do I do now? I know I'm going to go move on a boat, which I did, lived aboard a boat, and then took all of that time that I was training and dedicated it to learning monetary history and finance. And I thought, if these geeks, if these guys that I see going to the City of London, these people that I would say I probably have nothing in common with, if those guys can figure it out, then why can't I? And I've always had that attitude, Moni, that if somebody else can do it, why can't I? That's what I thought when I became a runner. I saw the professionals and I thought, if they're doing it, why can't I? I've just got to figure out the path. I've just got to figure out what works for me. And everyone's combination to succeed is going to be different. And whilst I don't see myself as anything special, I realized that my way of thinking was actually quite unique in some respects, particularly when it came to understanding finance and the way the world was turning and monetary resets. And I was just piecing things together, I guess, in a different way to others. And at some point, I realized there was an appetite for that. And I wanted to share more because I wanted to help other people too, to survive some of the hardships that are coming. And so that's where I took it. And I put out, my first video. It was a whiteboard video using dodgy camera. In fact, it looks like I'd filmed it on one of your garden potatoes. It was terrible. The sound quality sucked. But despite all of that, I think it got something like 10,000 views, it maybe more, 15,000. And it was only my second video on YouTube. So I thought, if people can watch me through a potato, surely they'll watch me through a better camera with some better audio. So I invested in a little bit of equipment. And then I was just lucky. I'm not going to lie. I was just lucky because I met some fantastic people. And the name Parallel Mike, it actually came from the first interview I ever did with Johnny Hoddle of the Staying Free podcast, who's become a friend of mine. In fact, he's getting married next year, and I was hoping to fly out to the wedding, but unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be able to make it because I've got something that's pretty substantial that I need to be in attendance for in the country I'm in. However, yeah, I did an interview with him, and he called me Parallel Mike because he thought I called myself it because it was my Twitter handle. Imagine if we did that. We just called everyone by the Twitter handle. There'd be some strange names going around. But anyways, that's where the name Parallel Mike came from. I did the Parallel Systems broadcast. That was my financial content. And then at some point, I just found that a lot of my other interests were really bleeding out into my YouTube videos, particularly the live streams. And I found that people were interested in that, the spiritual side of things that I discuss. I do have a degree in theology, so I've always had a huge interest in the meaning of life, you could say. It sounds like a big thing, but just finding out more about what is our purpose here and trying to use, I guess, morality and philosophy and theology to try and guide my own life. So I would discuss some of that on the show sometimes. And then also, I guess, just other interests beyond just finance. And so I found at some point that this was turning off some listeners. It was interesting others. So I thought, I need to spin off so I can do a podcast and have a separate space for all of those conversations. And for the many people that I wanted to speak to who had nothing to do with finance. Now, you'll know from being on the podcast, I do speak about finance here and I do have people on the show who are experts in that as well. However, there's many other things we discuss. Recently, I had an Orthodox priest on. I've had academics, historians, everyday people even that I met through my show. So PJ Bice, he was never a podcaster, or somebody that had public facing voice, but he reached out to me on Twitter. We became friends. He wrote a book. So I invited him on, and I just keep the podcast very flexible and free. And, I don't know if listeners like it. I have a small core audience. I wish it was bigger because I think the conversations we have here are important. I do have people sign up as members. Sometimes people disappear. Usually it's after an episode that's maybe a little bit controversial, but that's just the way it goes. I'm a man of many interests, so I try to satisfy all of them, and through my content, that's one way that I do it, and it's been fantastic, and I'm extremely grateful that people actually are interested and do support the content, particularly now over on Substack where it's a growing audience, and for some reason, Substack doesn't seem to shadow ban me like YouTube did. So that's growing quite fast and organically. And again, people want to listen to my financial stuff. And I think it's helping them. It's helping them a lot because there's so many risks out there that nobody's discussing. Nobody really specializes these days in wealth preservation and risk management like I do. So that's kind of a niche for me. And that is one of the reasons why I was one of the first people in the world to pick up on the Great Taking, is because I already had a good understanding of counterparty risk. I'm one of these people who reads terms and conditions and looks for small print, goes back through history to try and find how people have been screwed before and how I might be screwed again in the future by somebody. So yeah, that was something that was a natural fit for me, and it's helping a lot of people, and that makes me feel good. And so I continue to do it.
Brilliant. Yeah, your background is definitely very unique and versatile. But I think that's why what allows you to have that holistic, wholesome view on things. And you are not a person who just gives a very specific, very specific but limited outlook on things. You are able to capture the whole environment of things, which I really enjoy in the podcast. And I think that transpires and many people value it too. But I always wondered as well, like now we know why you're called Parallel Mike, but why did you decide to call your YouTube show Parallel Systems? What is Parallel Systems for you, and what did you try to convey some sort of message through it?
Yeah, I'll answer that. But just going back to what you said about having this kind of broad and holistic view, one thing I would say, and I don't know if everyone understands this, but sadly today, most content is entertainment. And the content people put out isn't always necessarily there to inspire people to take positive actions, to do something holistic, to become more self-sufficient. It's designed to get views and likes. It's clickbait. So you'll look at the title and the little thumbnail and it's terror, warning, must act now, cannot believe. And you look at certain channels and every video is like that going back 3 years and you're like, warning, cannot believe this just happened. And it's like, well, how many times is this the last warning? The last warning last week, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. Well, how many last warnings do we need? And I never wanted to do that. However, there are, of course, some things that are very alarming. So we have to discuss them. And sometimes the titles do sound alarming, but for me, those people that just spread fear and nonsense, yeah, that was never my goal. And if that ever became my channel, I would delete it in an instant. I've got no interest in that. So a small but perfectly formed community was what I was looking for. And I forgot the question, so I'm going to hand it back to you, Moni.
I was just considering what clickbait titles we could have. Like, I'm so glad you don't do it. It's just awful with those silly faces. But anyway, I wonder where the parallel systems come from. Like, what's the message behind the phrase parallel systems and what it's meant to entail?
It actually came from a book that I was reading at a very apt moment in history. So, of course, we had what happened throughout 2020 and 2022. It was the greatest assault on human liberty, and I would say the collective consciousness in history, period. There was nothing more catastrophic than that, and it destroyed the psychology of so many people, including many people that think they figured it out and woke up only to fall into the next stupid psyop, which is unfolding as we speak, this massive technocracy that's coming in all kinds of guises and Trojan horses, including in America. So during that time, I was reading a book. It was called 1989. I've got to turn around because I've actually got it on the bookshelf so I can give you the full title. It was 1989. Just collapsed my bookshelf. Revolution by Victor Sebastian. And it's a book that discusses the 12 months in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell and communism collapsed across Europe. And it does this from the perspective of these countries that most people don't know much, if anything, about. So there's Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Romania, and a number of others that kind of circle that part of the world. And it's discussing how that drama unfolded, that great drama of all of these nations that were living under totalitarianism, and then finally they became free. But it goes into the histories of that totalitarianism and how these nations dealt with it on an individual level. So every nation had a different flavor of totalitarianism, and some had revolutions multiple times. There was massacres. But in Poland specifically, they had this thing called Solidarność, which is solidarity. And it was a movement amongst the workers. It actually started in the city of Gdańsk, formerly Danzig, at the north of the country. Beautiful city. I was actually there just a week ago. Yeah, I was there a week ago. Absolutely stunning medieval city right there on the water. And I actually took a boat trip where it takes you up the river to a place called Westerplatte, which is actually where World War II began. That was the place that was first bombed by the Nazis. So that's a completely other history. And this part of the world is full of history, as you know. So I was reading up on that. And what happened was this movement called Solidarność happened in Poland, where there was these workers trying to circumnavigate the totalitarianism that the communists had forced upon the country. And the way that they started this movement was getting all workers to unionize and then to agree to strike together. Now, this didn't necessarily start out as something extremely subversive in terms of trying to bring down communism. It was people just trying to survive as they fired people for nonsense reasons, or they were trying to take the salary off people and just basically oppressing people. So they said, what we'll do is we'll all band together in a union. And if one factory strikes, other factories across the country will strike also. Now, if you remember recently, the truckers' protest in Canada, that was literally based off Solidarność. So the pastor over there, who's Polish, I can't remember his name, but he knows this history very well because he's from Poland. So he modeled those truckers' strikes on Poland. And you saw how hard they came down on those truckers because they understood that this is extremely powerful when lots of people act in unison. So the idea of parallel systems was from reading that book, learning this history, and recognizing that actually when totalitarianism was cloaking Europe, parallel systems were the way that people dealt with that. And what a parallel system is you've got the main structure of society, the main system, this authoritarian top-down system. And that's the totalitarian one. That's the one that oppresses people and brutalizes people. And the only way to survive with that and retain your dignity and some sense of freedom and liberty is to go underground and create a separate system, a fifth column, so to speak, a parallel system where you can speak freely, you can keep your free speech, you can trade outside the system, black market trading if you have to, whatever it is. You can share books that are dissident books. You can, I mean, today it would be podcasts, it would be newsletters and all kinds of things. But back then, it was people trying to survive when they knew that the main system could not be brought down immediately. You couldn't face it head on, because if you did, you'd get locked up, maybe murdered. So instead of facing it head on, they subverted the system at all opportunities, including with Solidarność, and they created a parallel system where people would act outside the system and circumnavigate its worst parts. And looking at where we was in 2020 to 2022, and I was reading this book and I thought that is precisely where we are in history. We're seeing totalitarianism emerge across the world, and it's coming in different guises, different forms. But I foresaw that that parallel systems were going to be absolutely necessary in the future, and so that was what spurred me to actually start putting my voice out there and creating some content, so I could be a part of that and actually share useful messages, hopeful messages, but also give people information that might steer them well clear of some of the worst things, like, for example, financial collapse or a reset, and these kind of things that if you are subject to, you will likely not be able to go on to the next phase. You will become dependent on the main system, which is going to be the worst system, in my opinion, if it succeeds. So you want to have the freedom to create a parallel system or to join another one. And that's where the name come from. So there you go.
Wow. I never knew about the start of the truckers' protest, and that was like, based on Solidarność. So that's definitely an interesting fact for me. And I can see why they don't like it. It's bottom up movement, that it's decentralized, organic, the structure's flat. You can take off the management and it's still going to function because it's basically working simply and people can navigate through it without much organization.
So, sorry to interrupt, Moni, but look how most people are responding right now. What are they looking for? It's top down. It's Elon Musk. It's Donald Trump. It's the billionaires. It's Larry Ellison, the guy who specializes in AI surveillance. It's Peter Thiel and Palantir creating mega databases. It's brain chips. I mean, come on, how stupid do you have to be to think that this is how we are going to retain our freedoms and liberties? They don't ever speak about the Constitution. They never speak about liberty. They speak about totalitarian tools, which are technocratic tools. So everything people are cheering on right now is top down, which is precisely the opposite of where you're going to find success in retaining your freedom and liberties. So it has to be from the bottom up. It always has been from the bottom up, and people are going to realize that too late. And we're going to suffer the worst aspects of totalitarianism because of it, unless, of course, you position yourself early enough and you've got good foresight, and therefore you can avoid certain aspects of it. But unfortunately, we are going to see things get worse before it gets better, because there's so many people that are just unwilling to take personal responsibility, because bottom up requires you to do something. You can't just sit there in front of your screen and tweet. And this goes back to what I was saying about content. Most people, the content creators and the audience, are there just to entertain or be entertained. There's no action that comes from it. There's no real desire to change anything. One person's got a desire to increase their reach and their wealth, and the other person just wants to be entertained. And they don't want to take personal responsibility because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of action. We've done that. I know you've done that in your life. I've done that in my life. And it can take years to really build something stable and strong and to change yourself. When I became a runner, it took many years to really get my potential. So unfortunately, yeah, people are looking for top down, not because they truly believe in it, although some do. But I think deep down, most people are just going along with it because what else can they do? Well, they can take personal responsibility, but that's going to be a long, hard road. And, I've got empathy for people. I get it. People are tired. But listen, when in history has that ever been the case? Over the past 100 years, has voting changed a thing? No, every time it propels us forward, further towards, I would say, the worst future. So I've got no belief that will come. And I think it's impossible, actually. I think this system is designed so it cannot happen. There's so many filters that a person has to go through. How many times are you going to fall for the hero billionaire narrative? So yeah, that's totally it. It needs to be bottom up. And the truckers' protest, yeah, that had all of the elements of a real movement, and that's why they crushed it so much. I mean, if you want to know that a movement's real, look at how they responded to that. It was canceling bank accounts. It was canceling the bank accounts of people who donated to it. So you could have donated 50 cents, a dollar, and you would have your bank account frozen out. And some of those people still have their bank accounts frozen now. They've been completely debanked, actually. And Pastor, I think it was Pastor Pavel or Arthur Pavel, something like that. I should really have his name. But anyways, I think he's been put in jail about 5 or 6 times now. So you can see how they deal with bottom up. And actually, the technocracy that's been instilled by Trump in America and the European Union right now, that will make it so much easier to crush any kind of bottom-up movement because all of our interactions are happening online. So once you've got the Palantir database where they know everything about you, your bank accounts, who you speak to, when you speak to them, and it's all there and available to them, well, you can see how easy it would be to stop a parallel system this time around. But we have to try. We have to remain hopeful because that's all we can do. And ultimately, I think if you have a belief in something good, if you have a belief in God, then you know that there's always hope. You know that there's always a better day coming. It just means that unfortunately, we might not get it today. So we've got to ride out the storm and do the best we can.
Definitely. Now it's a good time to create for ourselves options in terms of creating our little paradigm of parallel systems and, like that movability in our lives. But I think the need to take personal responsibility in every single life of every single person will transpire sooner or later. It's going to catch up. But the longer you wait for it, in my opinion, the more painful it's going to be. So it's better to do it voluntarily and early when the times are better. It's easier to set up certain ideas, try and see what fails because many things fails, but you need to have that courage. And not many people do have the courage to just get out of the paradigm that they've been, directed an entire life into and try something else, something that may work, get creative as well. So there's that part as well that I think people like creativity. They have a lot of beautiful creativity when it comes to interior design. Finding the best birthday card. But a little bit, being a little bit more creative when designing your own life, actually, is what we are missing. So definitely always encourage everyone to try and do it.
Well, I think that's a great comment because you're right. At some point, you are going to have to take personal responsibility. If you don't do it now, then you'll be forced to do it later. Because, of course, if you end up in a situation where they're telling you have to do this or you're not going to be able to feed yourself, you're not going to be able to clothe yourself, you're not going to be able to go out to public spaces. Well, if you take personal responsibility now, you can look at that and say, they've already told me that's what's going to happen. They've already told me they're going to control me through my bank account and digital currencies and digital IDs and biometrics. They've already told us. They've actually already started to implement it in many places. So you know that's coming. If you don't act on it now, you've submitted. You've already said that's the future that I'm accepting. So when you get to that future and all of those things are happening, all of a sudden you're going to be like, well, I need to do something about it, but it's too late. You'll have to take personal responsibility at that time anyways, because you won't have a choice. If you run out of food, if you run out of money, if you run out of options, or if your career forces things upon you because you didn't find a way to decentralize from your career. And listen, none of this is easy. None of this is easy for any of us. But at some point, it's going to happen. So if you take personal responsibility now, you get to choose parts of that future. You can choose your location for a start. And that's going to be one of the biggest and most influential decisions that you make. Where do I live? Who am I around? Am I in a place where I can take care of my needs a little bit better, where people around me have a little bit more self-sufficiency and a little bit more sense? If you live in one of these crazy Western cultures, I wouldn't want to live next to somebody on the far left or the right because the people on the right are just as nuts. They're telling me that the brain chip guy's here to save me. I don't want to be near that guy either. So you want to be around people that are just more sensible, and rural people generally are. Everyone has their own political views, yes, but you don't have to discuss that. So I would say find people around you that just naturally are already doing the things that you do. So you've got something in common already. You grow food, you've got a well, you heat your house on wood, simple stuff like that. And I'm sure there's people out there saying, well, it's impossible for me. I can't do it. Well, guess what? It was impossible for me at some point. So I found a way to do it. That's personal responsibility. It's not looking at the barriers and saying, I can't overcome those barriers and being stubborn about it. It's saying, yeah, there's barriers and I am going to overcome them. And that's a mindset. And most people have a deficiency of mindset right now. So they just look at the problems, they black pill themselves. And I just have never looked at the world like that. Or at least I haven't looked at it for the last, let's say, 10, 15 years. There was a time when I looked at the world like that. And guess what? I went nowhere. I went nowhere early in life because I always looked at all of the woe is me problems around, my life, my childhood, blaming it on this person, that person. But ultimately, none of it matters. It doesn't matter if you've been victimized. You have to take that personal responsibility because nobody else is going to come and save you. And actually, no matter what happens on the outside, your life will always be better if you do. You can improve your life. You can improve your resiliency. So I would say absolutely get started now. And it doesn't have to be a huge process. It can be as simple as starting to exercise if you've never exercised. Because guess what? Exercise gives you mental toughness as well as physical toughness. It means that you don't have to go to the doctors and use the poison medicines anymore. It starts to make you think about eating healthy, organic food, not foods that's sprayed with pesticides and poisoned. So just that one tiny act of saying, you know what, I'm going to start getting in shape. Now, all of a sudden, you've got all of these third, fourth, fifth, sixth order consequences that are actually really useful. You might start to run in nature. So now you're getting outside and you're clearing your head. You're detuning from some of the noise and propaganda and nonsense on the screens. There's so many benefits that can stem from just taking that first step on whatever it is. And again, if you are not happy in your current situation, or even if you are, there's always another step you can take. And that's the way I see it, is it's just a step-by-step process of improvement until you can't go any further. And if at some point, something comes along and changes everything and wipes it all out and you've got to start again, so be it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to do it to begin with, because I think that's the art of living, is just constantly striving to improve, to do something better, to be better. And I genuinely have seen in my life that it's changed not only my life, but the people around me, but also my friends and the people I've worked with and the people that come to me for group coaching. All of those people that take that path are happier, they're healthier, and they're in a better position. So why not go for that? Why not do it now? I'm starting to sound like one of these. I'm starting to sound like one of these Tony Robbins telling people how to improve their life, but I really don't want to sound preachy. I guess I'm speaking to the people who, find those barriers, because I meet those people. I often get them in comment section, of my YouTube channels, the whiners, the moaners, and I've just got no time for those people. My door's open for the people that are looking to get on board with saying, yeah, we can do something here. We don't have to just give up, because what's the point in that? If you're going to give up, then that's a sad future, I think.
Certainly, we have as much agency, I think, as we allow ourselves to have. It's a little bit like when you are climbing a mountain and you think, oh, this is all there is. And you see like just one hill. And then as you keep walking, you find that actually there is more hills. And now you can see 3, 4, and 5. So as things change in your life, the outlook of your situation sort of evolves as well and gives you new set of environment. But I wanted to speak about the solutions and more practical things in part 2. Get more your story as well, because you mentioned a bit earlier, which was that you got involved as well very early on in Great Taking. And I know that your video was I think it was the first one to really deeply analyze the book and take it very seriously. And you gave a lot of thought and analysis, which you shared with people as well on the subject. So what made you consider Great Taking as something that definitely is going to happen? It's very probable, and it's not a fantasy book.
Well, that's an interesting story, actually, that I've never shared, how I first came across the Great Taking. It was an interesting chain of events that was unlikely, really unlikely. So I first heard about The Great Taking through somebody that I worked with one-to-one who I was mentoring. And she sent me a message and she said, I'm sure you've already seen this, but did you watch Doug Casey's take, which is Doug Casey and Matt Smith? And I'm a big fan of Doug Casey and I'm a friend of Matt and a big fan of his too, although he thinks we're friends, but I'm actually a fan of his work as well. He's a really great guy. And they discussed a book called The Great Taking. Now, they only discussed it for about 5 minutes or so and said it's absolutely terrifying and you should read this book to the audience. So, of course, I immediately got on with that and I printed off the book and I read it all in one sitting. And I was just absolutely shocked by what I'd read. Although there was a part of me that was not shocked. It was shocking to see how this mechanism had been laid out. And of course, I've done episodes on this, so I'm not going to talk specifically about what that mechanism is. But essentially, it's a 4-decade-long march towards creating a system where in a major financial crisis, all of our assets, whether that's mortgage property, factories, machinery, farm equipment, or equities and bonds that we own outright or we think we own outright can be taken. They can be taken because it's being used as collateral by the highest level of finance, the big banks, the JP Morgans. They are using our assets as their collateral, including the unencumbered assets of equities and bonds, which is terrifying to think of because it means that when the next big crisis hits, everything can get taken and you've got the totalitarian system there. It's impossible to escape. So that was how I came across the book. And I immediately read it in one sitting. And then I went to bed that night. And this is something I've never shared in any interview, but I've shared it with the author, David Rogers Webb, who has become a friend of mine, that I woke up about 3 a.m., 4 a.m. Now, I never wake up at that time. It's very rare. It's not like I haven't in the past, but it's very rare. And I had a voice in my head that said, you have to make an episode on this immediately, as in tomorrow. You have to get up and make this episode. And the voice, it was kind of an intuitive voice. It said to me, if you do that, it's going to be important. For some reason, it's very important that you make that episode. Now, bearing in mind, this book was extremely complex. It's discussing things that I had no knowledge of, no foreknowledge of many of the mechanisms. However, I did have some understanding of counterparty risk and of how these things can work. So I read the book again the next day and I prepared to make the episode that evening. And as you said, it was the first video in the world that really went into depth in terms of what it is, how it works, how it's going to unfold. And I kind of went through the book. I even did some research to find out if David Rogers Webb was legitimate. And I put that into the video to say, I found some information from the book. I've cross-referenced it. And I found this article from 2003 about a man called David Rogers Webb who had a hedge fund that was dealing in billions of dollars. And that's exactly what the man in the book says. So I even managed to kind of verify who he was. And yeah, that video was the only video in the world for about 5 or 6 weeks on that subject that really went into it and discussed it in a serious way without just saying, oh, there's a book, go read it. That was kind of picking it apart. And it was crazy because I later found out politicians, billionaires had watched that. It was nuts. It became so big. If you searched for it, I came up. In fact, if you searched for it in Google and looked at the videos, I was the one who came up, which was wild because I hadn't written the book. And the other interesting part of that story is I actually found the phone number of the author, David Rogers Webb, and I called him up the day I released it, which was, I guess, out of the blue for him. And I left him a message, a voicemail, and then got on with my day, went out to run, and I came back and I had a missed call. And I was like, wow, somebody's called me back. And at that point, I had no idea, am I talking to a real person? I mean, I'd done a little bit of cross-referencing and he seemed to be real. And I genuinely felt the book was true. Something intuitively said to me, this is correct. This is the missing piece of the whole structure that you've been discussing. Because, of course, I've discussed about how the system's going to implode and people will lose money. But this was kind of a hidden piece. But there was something intuitively that said it was correct. And I spoke to David that night and I immediately knew that I'd hit it off with this guy because as I called him, he said, well, I'm just harvesting apples here on the farm. So I found out he lived on a farm. He said, I'm sat in the kitchen harvesting apples, making apple puree. And at the time, we was harvesting and we was creating, I can't remember what we was making in the kitchen, but we was canning vegetables as well. So there was some funny synchronicity there. And I think he appreciated that I had this ballsiness about me to just call him up. And I called him up because I wanted to speak to the man who wrote this book. So I immediately said, thank you for writing the book. I've created an episode on it. And he said, oh, I know, I've watched it already. And he's such a gracious man, David. He was like, I'm so thankful that you made this episode. I was like, I just hope I've done even, some semblance of justice to this fantastic piece of work that you've done. And anyways, this just was really the first step in a really crazy journey, because as the video, as this message about the Great Taking got out, everyone was trying to get in touch with David Rogers Webb, but he had no desire to discuss the book. He was somebody that had written the book, and his plan was, I'm going to write this book, I'm going to put it out there, and that's me done. I'm stepping away. I've got no interest in being in the limelight. I've got no interest in doing interviews for this. I just want to get the message out there. And as he wrote that book, he'd actually taken himself away, and he'd gone and literally spent months sat there by himself with a laptop, not connected to the internet, writing this book in complete solitude. And he didn't tell anyone about it because he understood, I think he intuitively knew that what he was writing was very hot, too hot to handle, you could say. And I think it took a lot out of him. I mean, you can imagine writing this book and having this knowledge that nobody else in the world has. It's not public at all. And you know that when you unleash that, there's a domino that's being pushed and it's never being put back up. It's all of a sudden it's going around the world. And so I think he needed a break, and people started to call me up for interviews because they couldn't get in touch with David, but my video was there and they could tell that I understood it, and I'd done, a lot more research after the video. I continued to just study it. And I was like, well, I don't want to do any interviews on it because it's not my place to. It's not my book. But I spoke to David about it, and he asked me, he said, well, if you would do the interviews, I'd really appreciate it, seeing as you're kind of a podcaster. So I said, absolutely. If you want me to, I'll do it. So I spoke with Tom Bodrovics, who I'd become friends with because I'd been on his show before. And I said to Tom, have you seen this book, The Great Taking? And he said, yeah, I've seen it. He said, I've tried to reach out to the author, but he's not emailed me back. And I said, well, I'll ask him for you, even though he's already told me that he doesn't want to interview. So I said, well, I'll ask him for you. But David still was like, I'm not really feeling doing interviews. So, if you and Tom want to discuss it, go for it. I'd really appreciate it. So that's what happened. And, at that point, it wasn't this period now where there's thousands of videos and articles. At that point, it was so early that the only thing that existed was the book. And just to let you know how the book got to me, this is how it went. So David had the book. He sent it to somebody in New Zealand. That person's gardener was handed a copy, and they gave it to Matt Smith. And I have to give credit to Matt as well, because Matt was the first person to publicly mention it. So Matt's been a huge part of the process as well. He became friends with David. So really it's been a collaboration between numerous people. But like I said, really early on, that first interview with Tom, at that point, the world really didn't know about it. And Tom's podcast, I would say, is the most substantial. It's the most significant in terms of the gold and silver space. And if you look at the people who are on that show, that's kind of the audience you get. So the audience are people that are very, very high up in the financial food chain. And I knew that once it got to that point, once that interview on Palisades was released, it was too late. Because at that point, they still could have crushed it. And I was really worried about that. And I was actually worried about having that information and it not being public knowledge. I thought the best thing that can happen for David, for me, and for the 2 or 3 people who know about this is just to spread this information far, because it'll be better for everyone. So that day, I remember going for a run in the forest in the morning, and I got back to the car and I just had this really eerie feeling. Something big was about to happen. And so I quickly got in the car, drove home, did that interview with Tom, and that interview just blew up. So that interview got hundreds of thousands of views. And after that, the cat was completely out the bag. There was no going back at that point because so many people had listened to it and shared it. And I did a few more interviews, but really I wanted to step back eventually myself because David was the author and I was fatigued. This was a crazy few months. I was getting interview requests from Brazil, from Mexico, from Canada. Everyone wanted to talk about The Great Taking, and I was the first person they was kind of speaking to, I think there was radio silence for a while because people were scared to touch it. But at some point, it flipped and all the big channels took it over. And David then started to do interviews. So that was my time to go back into the shadows, I guess. Although, I guess that's not quite true because, as you know, and as listeners know, I've been working to put out content about the Great Taking ever since. And I've done numerous interviews with David. And actually, the past few months, he's only interviewed on my show, I think, because he's got serious concerns, as I do, about where we're going. And the idea that really we're now entering that final stage potentially because there's unprecedented things happening. So that's the long story, Moni. I hope I didn't ramble too long, but that's kind of the real story as to how it happened. And it took on a life of its own. And the great thing about this is there's so many people that have now worked on it to share that message. I think that's just a tribute to the respect that people have for David for writing that book, and they wanted to help him with that, so he wasn't an island. And I'm a tiny part of it, a tiny part of it. But for David, at that point, for him, it was very significant because it was the first time somebody, I guess, run with it, said, I'm going to go with this as well. I'm going to put this out there and discuss it. And I think that was just reassuring it. And he's told me privately, that meant a lot to him at that time, as I'm sure it would. And as I said, I did have the feeling that it was important for some reason. It was almost, I have a religious belief in terms of, I believe in a creator and a God. So I think that's what it was. I was being told that, okay, you've got this tiny little channel, you've got a microphone, you've got a camera. Somebody needs to do this. Somebody needs to step up at this point. Do you want to do it? And it was like, okay, I'll do it. And for some reason, that video I added, I was a little bit silly in it, I think, which helped. It delivered it in a way that people could digest. And that's that. That was the story of the Great Taking.
Well, that's a great story of great collaboration, I would say. It's a little bit like that domino effect where you need every single piece in the right place so that the motion could happen, and the things could be moved forward. And definitely there were lots of people collaborating to an outcome we've got today, which is people at least informed, which is important. And certainly I know because I've been following you from the start, you always said that they're going to do the Great Reset, and this is now provided that missing piece showing how they're going to achieve it. So definitely it's an important information. And I remember you had interviewed David as well for your podcast episode. And I remember he said something very profound, which stuck with me for a long time, which is him exploring the Great Taking made him come to a conclusion that there are no black swans as such. And I thought that's so true. Like everything that happens may be, a surprise to us because we're not informed about it. But certainly it's not something that came out organically out of nowhere, that those things, those big collapses, those surprises are baked into the cake. They are included in legislation, as we see through his book and work. And they just, once something's triggering the whole set of domino effect of legislation triggering other legislation and certain specific behaviors, it's all designed, and people may not see where it ends, but the end has been intended and designed to happen the way it did.
Yeah, well, I think if you look back throughout history, there's many events that were told or we frame as black swans. This was a black swan, but actually the further you are out from those events, like, for example, the 1929 stock market crash that led to the Great Depression, the more you can see the hidden hand and that actually this wasn't something that came out of the blue. The Federal Reserve was raising interest rates for 2 years going into the Great Depression, having kept them artificially low to fuel the bubble. So when the bubble burst, because interest rates went up and the banks had to start calling in their debt and the margin calls, that spiraled out of control, and the market crashed, and people said, wow, Wall Street's crashing and they're doing everything they can to stop it. And it's like, well, wait a minute. They fueled the bubble, and then they popped it. So was it really a black swan? And it's just the same today. when we got to 2020, there was many people that said, this is a once in 100-year pandemic. And it's like, well, they've been talking about this pandemic that's going to come for many, many years. There was Event 201 in 2019 that perfectly scripted exactly what was going to happen. And then we had this market event, the repo market spike, that required trillions of dollars of intervention. But how was that going to happen? Well, then we had this pandemic that required trillions of dollars to flood into the system. So yeah, your black swans are actually setups. Now, I would disagree with David on one thing. He said there are no black swans. David himself was the black swan. His book was a black swan. So sometimes there are black swans and they don't come from the top down. They are people, courageous people that stand up and decide to do something off their own back and show extreme courage. And they are divinely led. They have a guide, whether they know it or not, to do something that's very good, do something that's pure and good because they understand it's going to help a lot of people. And those things are black swans. And I think people who enact great evil in the world, they don't understand good. They don't understand good people. They don't understand that somebody would want to do something not for profit, that somebody would want to do something that could be potentially harmful or put themselves in hardship. They don't understand somebody caring about other people, having actual empathy, because they don't have any of that. And if you don't have empathy, how can you understand the other? So that's the real black swans, is actual good people who do things because they want to help people or protect the vulnerable. And the more people that do that, the more it actually erodes the power structures of bad, because those people, yeah, they can't account for goodness in their models, in their technocracy, in their AI digital panopticon. They can't account for really good people. So if you want to break the system, you become a really good person. You have morality, dignity, and you support other people. And that actually, I would say, that breaks the models that they've got. And that's why David was the real black swan, in my opinion.
Certainly. I believe they can't model intuition and inner guidance that they just don't have. That's a good point. But you also mentioned the markets, and I wonder what parallels can you see with what was happening during the Great Depression and what we are going through now. I think we hear a lot of details of things happening here and there, but it's difficult to sort of like envision a great picture of from the macro level, where we are at the moment. Is it a start? Is it middle? It hasn't started yet, perhaps. Like, what's happening at the moment and what's the significance of it?
In terms of parallels, everything, absolutely everything screams this is the same setup as the Great Depression. And to discuss what I mean by that is, going into the Great Depression, you saw the system hollowed out before the collapse come. And I liken it to a building. There's a building that I've been driving by for about 2 years and it's been demolished now. But before they demolished it, they hollowed it out. And what I mean by that is they took out all the windows, they took all the furniture out, all of the equipment, all of the wiring. So including the internal walls as well. So the ones that could be taken down. So it was really just the core structure left. And on the bottom, it kind of looked like it was on stilts. You was like, wow, how is this building staying up? And I'm guessing the engineers perfectly and precisely understood how much they could take out without it collapsing. Now, I didn't trust those engineers. When I drove past that, I drove fast. I was like, I'm getting out of the way of this damn thing because it looks like it's going to go at any second. But that's what they did. They hollow it out so they can easily demolish it and do it in a controlled way. So it's not going to go left or right. It's going to go nice and pancake down. And the financial system going into the Great Depression was a lot like that. They created a stock market bubble. Now, bearing in mind, there's many things today that are different to the 1920s. In the 1920s, the percentage of Americans that actually owned stocks was tiny. It was a tiny amount of Americans. You're talking maybe less than 10% of people. Today, it's everyone, because even if you don't buy stocks directly, you're exposed to it through all different kinds of ways. Insurance companies, pensions. Of course, your bank is filled with the bank that you use. You put your deposits there, you think you're safe, but that bank is dealing in all kinds of bets and derivatives and has bonds underlying their reserves. So when the bonds crash, which is what's happening right now, and we'll come back to that in a moment, it destroys the equity of the bank, which is precisely what happened going in to 1929. So what they did was they built a massive bubble. So they set up the Ponzi financial system in terms of equities and prepared that to fail. And going into 1929, they started to sharply increase interest rates. Now, this wasn't interest rates going to some crazy level. And that's something people don't understand. People think, oh, well, it only went up from, let's say, 2% to 4.5%. However, it was the rate of increase, and it was going from a very low level to a high level, because if you have super low interest rates for a prolonged period of time, that's the price of money. And if you make the price of money effectively zero, people will take on lots of loans, lots of debt, and they will no longer use that for productive uses. They're not going to use it to invest in a fantastic business idea. They're going to use it to speculate at some point. And that's precisely what we saw going into the GFC and out of the GFC and going into 2000 as well. They just made the price of money really cheap. Now, if you look at what's happened since the great financial crisis, they took interest rates to almost zero. And you had all of these CEOs buying back shares because, of course, most CEOs are reimbursed through shares in the company. So they were taking on billions of dollars of loans and then just using it to buy back shares. Now, of course, the shareholders were happy because they were seeing the prices of these companies go up, but not because the companies were doing great or because they had a great business or had real growth, because it was a Ponzi. They were just buying back shares, and the CEOs were then retiring saying, wait, the shares have gone up 500%, I'm out of here, and they got a big payday. But the longer you do that, the more bubbles you create. So they did the same in housing. You take the interest rates to zero, well, now people can take on more debt, so they start to bid up house prices. And house prices prior to 2007, 2006, it was about 3 or 4 times the average salary. Today, you're talking in some countries like Canada and Australia, it's like 14, 15 times the average salary. It's a bubble. So they create this massive bubble. And in 1929, at some point, they just popped it. And when they popped it, it destroyed the stock market. But the way it destroyed the everyday man and woman is it led to the bank failures. So the banks had lots of debt. They'd been lending on margin to people. So people were buying stocks on margin because the banks gave them loans very cheaply. And then what you had was lots of property that the banks had in their portfolio, and all of these loans defaulted on. So it's almost like the banks had these unrealized losses, because once the losses became manifest because the system started to come under really serious stress, you started to see bank failure after bank failure after bank failure. And then all of the power was consolidated in the Federal Reserve System, which was the point. It was the point to consolidate the banking system in the Federal Reserve and their system so that they could choose the winners and get rid of a lot of the competition. Similarly, they used that opportunity to confiscate the gold. And the reason they did that was not necessarily because they wanted the gold. And in fact, they didn't get a lot of the gold. They got about 25% of the nation's gold. So there was a lot of people who didn't hand over their money because they were smart. And of course, gold was the real money. But the reason they wanted to do that was because they needed to take gold out of the system. They wanted to go to a purely fiat system. So it was a financial reset with a very clear agenda. And it had a very clear setup of the dominoes, knowing that at some point they would push the domino and it would lead to those outcomes. And it would give them the opportunity. Now, of course, they needed some hardship to get all of the gold and to get people to accept that no longer are you going to be paying me in real money. You're going to be getting pieces of paper that you cannot convert into gold. I mean, it's ridiculous if you think about it. Of course, today people have normalized it because we've had that system for so long. Now, looking at where we are today, we're in exactly the same situation. Exactly the same situation, because they've hollowed out the system, and they've done that through record low interest rates, then record rate increases. And that's done a number of things. Firstly, it's leading to the popping of the everything bubble, which is ridiculous. It's an insane bubble, and all bubbles eventually burst. Now, when that bubble bursts, just think about how many people are exposed to these equities. It's going to bankrupt the system because so many people have their pensions invested in that, whether it's equities or bonds. And it's going to destroy so many people financially. And then, of course, you've got the banks, and the banks are exposed to it in 2 ways. Firstly, their entire equity is held in bonds, which have just been destroyed in terms of the price. So we've seen the collapse in bond prices. And the way that happened is the banks had these bonds that were yielding, let's say, 1% or 2%, and they were buying them for almost a decade after the GFC. And then all of a sudden, the bond yields went up to 4%, 5%. Now, what that does is if you're holding, let's say, a 10-year bond or a 20-year bond or a 30-year bond, let's say a 30-year bond that's yielding 2%, and now all of a sudden the 30-year bond rate goes up to 4.5%. Well, that destroys the price of your bond, because if you came to me money and said, right, Mike, I've got a bond, I'm going to sell you it, it's yielding 2%, and there's another bond that's just been issued that yields 4.5%, what does that mean about your bond? It means it's worth less, and I'm going to give you a lower price for it. Now, remember, banks take the deposits of people and then they convert it into these bonds. And the problem is, if something happens that requires the banks to sell those bonds, well, all of a sudden, the unrealized losses that they have on their balance sheet become realized. And people say, oh, it's only unrealized losses. They can hold the bonds to maturity and then they'll roll it over and it'll be fine. And it's like, well, look what happened with Silicon Valley Bank. They couldn't hold it to maturity. Look what happened in the UK with the LDI crisis. They weren't even holding bonds. They were holding derivatives of bonds. So what we've just seen recently is we saw these rapid increases in the long bonds, and nobody wants to buy those bonds anymore. So the US 20-year auction for bonds, the Japanese 30, and I think they've had a 40-year auction, or there's one coming up. Nobody's buying the bonds because nobody trusts that they're going to get that capital back in 20, 30 years. So nobody wants those bonds, which means the price is collapsing and the yield is going up. And where still, people are selling those bonds. So people who already own the bonds, they're ditching them, especially US Treasuries. Now, that's really serious because, of course, the US dollar is the global reserve currency, and that is meant to be the entire base layer of the system. I mean, all sovereign bonds form somewhat the base layer, but the US dollar is the global reserve, so that really is the base layer. When that is no longer trusted, that's it, game over. The system's done. If you cannot get people to buy those bonds and nobody wants them and they're ditching them, and where are they ditching them and going into? They're going into gold, which is the real safe haven asset. But for most of our lifetimes, people have been buying debt and believing that debt is an asset. And just think about how crazy that is, that they issue debt that can only be paid by issuing more debt, which has more interest that can only be paid by issuing more debt. I mean, of course, at some point it all collapses. Now, we're entering that stage, but before you get to the collapse, you have to do what? Well, it goes back to that building analogy that I gave you. You have to hollow out the system. So you create an everything bubble. You get everyone invested in it, whether they like it or not. You transfer everyone's pensions into it. You get all of the insurance companies, all of the banks, all of the institutions to go into the system. You create a massive dynamite TNT bomb by having this huge bubble. Then you hollow out all the banks, the commercial banks, by making their balance sheets have massive amounts of unrealized losses. And then you just push the domino and it all goes very quickly. And what happens in the end game? Well, the great taking happens because everything starts to fail. And as everything starts to fail, there is a protected class. So there's actually a class of banks who don't have exposure to that collapse. They're considered the secured creditors, which goes back to David's book. And what that means is all of the collateral, which is there's only a small amount in the system, because bearing in mind, there's 2 to 4 quadrillion in derivatives alone, and there's not enough collateral in the world to satisfy that. But what happens is the banks that I'm discussing, they're shielded from all of that collapse. And we're still, the assets that do exist that you might think are yours and you have ownership and property rights over, it gets scooped up and sent to them. So then you find out, oh, my pension's gone, my bank account's empty, and I'm never getting it back. And then, of course, you'd get told, well, don't worry, here's a digital wallet, get your digital ID and some UBI, and we'll fix it. Although I think it would come after a period of real hardship, just like the Great Depression. They get people into a place of real hardship so they accept the solution. And that's why it's exactly the same. And you could even throw tariffs in there as well. In the Great Depression, you had the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which came just a year or so into that Great Depression collapse. Although you could argue it wouldn't have been a Great Depression were it not for the tariffs. The tariffs collapsed world trade. So you saw imports to the US collapse by 60% because of the tariffs. Unemployment at that point doubled. So the consequences were pretty bad, but they were nowhere near as bad as they were after the tariffs. Now, what we're seeing take place right now, the third and final ingredient of this is the tariffs, which are destroying world trade. We're seeing the bifurcation between East and West, and America is saying to European nations and other nations, if you buy from China, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. So there's this forced divorce that's happening between the world and China, who is the manufacturing, they are the world's manufacturing hub. You can't decouple from them, not without collapsing the entire system. You know, China's been preparing this for a long time. We've seen the rise of BRICS, and they're creating separate structures because they're creating their own parallel system, actually. To go back to what you was discussing before, they are creating the parallel system to escape the financial system because they were watching what the Americans were doing. And after the GFC, they said, well, wait a minute, this ain't looking too good. And maybe we don't want to be a part of that either. Maybe we can come up with a solution together. And the US said no. So they started to build their own system. And it looks like it was warranted because, of course, the US stole Russian reserves and all kinds of craziness has happened. Nord Stream got blown up. So we're really living now through this global hybrid war, and it's all to do with the collapse of the old system, the collapse of the post-World War II order. And we are in the early innings of that, but it's really going to speed up now. And the bond crisis that we're seeing take place, which nobody's really discussing, is a huge, huge part of this. Once you get to that stage, you are very close to that, you know, catastrophic collapse. And it can go on for years. It's not something that necessarily happens overnight. The collapse can go on for many years, and I'm sure there'll be many things that arise that are attributed or that the collapse is attributed to. So it could be war, it could be conflict of some kind. And they say, oh, well, that's why it happened. But actually, it's not why it's happened. And maybe some people will figure it out, but I think maybe some people won't, because that's what happened with the Great Depression. Even now, if you listen to an academic discuss it, they say, well, they tried to do everything they could to save the system. And yeah, so that's why I think we're at a serious juncture. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's like a child dealing with fire, and you know, at some point, the fire is gonna catch, and a tragedy is gonna happen, because, as you said, everything's based on debt essentially. So there is no foundations, and a huge house of cards has been built, so it had to be blown away at some point.
That's it. There's no foundation to the system. So once that debt starts to implode, there's nowhere else for the system to go. So you can either have debt. Once you put debt as the base layer, you either have the system collapse, or you try and escape the system before the collapse by running into gold. That's why the gold price has gone up so much the last few years, is the people who can and understand what's happening, they're rushing into gold. That's why China's got 40,000 tons. That's why Russia's got, I'd say, at least 12,000 tons. And now you're seeing institutional investors start to go to it. And those guys have no idea about gold. Those guys are dummies when it comes to gold. They think it's a commodity. They don't understand it. But even they are getting a whiff that something's not right and saying, well, I'll buy this metal. And they don't understand it. But the people that do understand it, of course, have been doing this for some time. But the real turning point, I would say the final step in this is when you start to see central banks buy a lot of gold, and then you get the institutional investors and the wealthy families say, well, we're going to buy gold too. You're just on a countdown to the end at that point, and it's going to come thick and fast.
Certainly. I think that's a good point to break part one. And in part two, I would like to talk more about gold and how to get prepared, and some practical views. Maybe if I could get out of you, would be great.
Well, I appreciate you interviewing me, Moni. It was a fantastic interview with some great questions. So thank you so much for being my interviewer, and also for listeners. Thank you for listening. Of course, if you'd like to stick around for part number 2, you can find that over on parallelmic.com, where you can become a member to support the show, support the content, and access part 2 of each and every episode. So with that, I'm looking forward to seeing you in part 2, Moni.
Oh, me too. See you later.
What you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
In the 17th chapter of St. Luke it is written, the kingdom of God is within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you, the people, have the power.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.